My name is Brian Croft, and I'm the senior pastor of Auburndale Baptist Church here in Louisville, Kentucky. And I also founded a ministry called Practical Shepherding, which just celebrated our 10-year anniversary. That is a ministry of resources and trying to train pastors and care for pastors, teach them about the practical aspects of ministry, the things that they don't learn at seminary, but they need to know for ministry. A third hat I wear is I'm the senior fellow for the Mathena Center for Church Revitalization at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. So Facing Snarls and Scowls is connected in a very direct way to biblical church revitalization. It's kind of the follow-up to it in a way because it fits in the same world, but it's about preaching in that environment. So it's a preaching book. And James Carroll, who I wrote the book with, came to me, approached me about this book, and my reaction was, we don't need another preaching book. There's 10 preaching books I can recommend, and so there's no need for us to do this. And he said, just hear me out. And I said, okay. And within 30 minutes before I had finished my cup of coffee, he had me one that this was a preaching book that didn't exist, that needed to be written. So there's a uniqueness to it in that preaching category, but it's coming out of my story in church revitalization. So I went to a church that was very hostile in the first 4 or 5 years. So 3 different movements to get me fired in the first 5 years of the church. And as I tell my story, a lot of people focus on the conflict and the fights and everything that I had to try to deal with in those first 5 years. This book tells that same story, but with the preaching implications of all that. So I went into this church with the idea that I'm supposed to preach my heart out and preach God's word, and God's going to breathe life into this church through the word, which is what he eventually did. The problem is, a lot of people didn't like me coming in and preaching the word. I was also a young preacher trying to learn how to preach at the same time, which is a bad idea to try to go in and learn to preach in that environment, but that's what I did. So Facing Snarls and Scowls is about how do you preach in a hostile environment like that. What James brings to the table is very important, though, because I had this unique experience to go and preach literally to snarls and scowls for the first few years. But James went into a church that needed revitalization, but it was a bigger church. It was a stable church from a financial perspective and people. But what James faced was the apathy to the word that is more common when you go into a dying church. So we found that either hostility or apathy is usually one of the hindrances that a pastor finds when he tries to go in and preach the Bible in these places. So those are kind of the 2 pieces to it. The adversary side of it is what both of us faced in different ways from a personal perspective, different kinds of suffering and affliction that just comes in a pastor's life. So Facing Snarls and Scowls is about those 3 areas and how that preaching ministry is affected in all of those particular areas. So I enjoy writing books with other people. So our Practical Shepherding ministry has a ton of books that I intentionally co-wrote with others to just bring them in to realize they had things to offer in that particular book that I wanted to bring into it that I didn't have. So I've really enjoyed co-writing and trying to find 2 writing voices and mix them together. James is an exceptional writer, and though I've written more books, he's a much more gifted writer than I am. So when I discovered that with his first book, Collateral Damage, I realized what a gifted writer he was. And so when he came to me about this writing project, I realized we would be able to write this in a way that I thought was going to be smooth and helpful. And that's exactly what we did. James wrote a large portion of this. And so I came in and wrote some different sections with him. So one book, sometimes when I co-write a book, it'll be I write half and the other author writes half, and we bring them together. The other version of a co-written book I do, which is what this is that James wrote the majority of it, and I wrote a smaller portion of it, but he and I really put the outline and the flow together of this book, and the content of this book is equally shared. He just ended up writing more sections of it. And I think people who read it will see that there's just a smoothness to James's writing that's very clear and helpful. And so we took our sections together, knowing I'm coming from the hostility side, he's coming from more the apathetic side. And so you'll see that give and take in the book. I'm also the one writing, advocating for why this book is needed. When I had to be sold on it, and I realized this was a really important book, I think, that needs to be out there. There's nothing currently that addresses preaching and church revitalization in this movement yet. So this book potentially is going to hopefully pioneer that work in the midst of a lot of resources being written. And so James and I felt we could bring our parts together, and I'm really happy with how it came together in that way. My hope that this book would encourage pastors in this way, that they would, a lot of the, in our tribe anyways, there's a big encouraging recovery of biblical preaching and the importance of preaching in the local church, which I'm grateful for. The problem is young pastors are going into churches all excited to preach the word, and they've heard that that's what they're supposed to do, and they go in, and in 5 or 6 months, their preaching's not received. In fact, they may be greeted with hostility like I received, and they get discouraged real fast. They forget that there's so much more to this ministry than just preaching. However, we have to say that preaching is the centerpiece of a pastor's ministry, and the way that public proclamation is the way that God brings life to the church in that word going out when the whole congregation gathers. So preaching arguably is the most important task of a pastor. And so they go in and they preach, and they got to figure out how to preach through the adversity and the hostility and the apathy that they face. This book is hopefully going to advocate for, first of all, the preaching ministry is central to the work they need to do. However, there's areas they need to grow in to make sure they're preaching well. They need to be encouraged that they just need to keep preaching even though it's not being received. So this book is important in the revitalization category especially, because in our tribe there's many who would say preaching is the most important thing. So a lot of it rises and falls on how well someone preaches, how much they persevere in that preaching ministry, how much they're willing to pour themselves into preaching and not try to fight all these other battles that might get them fired in the first couple of years, and just keep preaching. And so a book about preaching, knowing that arguably is the most important task for a preacher and a pastor to be able to bring life into a church, it's an essential piece, and that's what we want this book to provide. So James and I both agreed, and we advocate in the book, that we advocate for expository preaching through books of the Bible. There's different ways to preach. Topical sermons aren't bad, but for a steady diet, we feel that as much of the Bible in its original context you can give a church, in the way you're training your people how to read it that way, and it's also, I think, the way God intended His Word to go out, and that's how He most effectively breathes life into a church. So we advocate for that preaching approach, which is in a lot of preaching books. That's not real unique to the book, but we felt we needed to advocate for that. We didn't want to assume that that's what everybody's understanding about how to approach preaching. And then we try to help guys understand that this is historically the way that preaching has gone in churches. So we actually look at history, and some of the preachers a lot of us would celebrate. A lot of people don't realize how hard their preaching ministry was, and the adversity that they faced with it, the hostility that Edwards and Simeon and Spurgeon all faced, some of these different historical figures that we love. They faced all these things. We love to look at their ministry after they're gone and say, wow, look at all the things God did with them. We want to remind everybody that the preaching ministry was not all roses all the time. In fact, it was very difficult, and they had to persevere through that. So I find a lot of encouragement reading biographies, remembering the heroes that I look back and see and want to emulate. So we want to advocate for a certain preaching model. We want to point to these figures in history to say, this is what they did. This is how God breathed life into the church. And then we advocate. We actually want to get really practical to say, here's how you push through the hostility. Here's how you're patient in the apathy that you face. Here's how you persevere through the adversity that you'll face in your ministry. So we try to cover all of those things as hope to encourage these pastors.